They thought it was just an old shed. But what was inside would change their lives. Caleb and Chloe walked across the dry land they had inherited from their grandmother Martha, trying to decide the fate of those arid acres that didn't seem to be worth much. The matriarch's death 3 weeks prior had left the siblings with the responsibility of settling matters she had never properly explained. That's when Chloe stopped abruptly, pointing to a rusty structure that stood out in the middle of the parched field. A corrugated metal shed with peeling paint and holes in its side stood there like a ghost from the past that no one in the family had ever mentioned. "Caleb, did you know this was here?" asked Chloe, adjusting the backpack on her shoulders as she observed the abandoned building. Caleb stopped beside his sister, wiping the sweat from his brow with his shirt sleeve. At 22, he had always been the more practical of the two, focused on quickly sorting out the inheritance paperwork so he could get back to his job in the city. "Never heard of it." "Grandma never said anything about a shed," he replied, with a suspicious expression. "It's probably just an old tool storage. Let's finish measuring the land and get out of here." Chloe, 3 years younger than her brother, had always had a natural curiosity that led her to question everything. Since she was little, she used to ask questions that bothered the adults in the family, especially about their paternal grandfather, who had disappeared when they were still children. "It doesn't hurt to take a look," insisted Chloe, already walking toward the shed. "If we're going to sell this place, we at least need to know what's on the property." The mid-afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on that part of West Texas, and the dry wind kicked up little clouds of dust with every step they took. The plants around them were sparse and hardy, typical of those that survive with little water and lots of sun. As they approached the structure, they realized it was more preserved than it had seemed from a distance. The metal, though rusty, still held a firm structure. There were old padlocks on the main doors, but Chloe noticed that one of the side panels was loose, creating an opening wide enough for a person to pass through. "Chloe, we're not going in there," said Caleb, putting a hand on his sister's arm. "It could be dangerous. What if it belongs to someone?" "What do you mean, belongs to someone?" "This is our family's, Caleb." "Grandma had everything documented," replied Chloe, already crouching to pass through the opening. Caleb sighed, recognizing it would be useless to try to stop his sister once she got an idea in her head. Reluctantly, he followed her inside the structure. The interior of the shed was plunged into a dusty gloom, lit only by shafts of sunlight that came through the gaps and openings in the structure. The smell of rusty metal mixed with dry earth dominated the space. As their eyes adjusted to the low light, the siblings could make out piles of boxes covered with plastic tarps, old tools hanging on the walls, and at the back of the shed, a long table covered by a darker tarp. "Look at this," murmured Chloe, walking between the boxes. "There's stuff here from decades ago." Caleb remained near the entrance, still reluctant to explore the place. His practical nature made him want to settle the inheritance situation quickly and return to his life in Chicago, where he worked as an accountant in a small but stable firm. Chloe, on the other hand, felt a strange familiarity with that place, as if she had been there before in some distant dream. She approached the covered table and, without hesitation, pulled off the tarp that covered it. What they found left both of them silent for long seconds. The table was covered with scattered papers, some yellowed with age, others still with their original colors preserved. An old typewriter occupied the center of the table, with a sheet of paper still inserted in the roller, as if someone had interrupted their work mid-sentence. "My God," whispered Chloe, carefully picking up one of the papers. "Look at the date on this, Caleb. 1987. Caleb moved closer, his curiosity finally overcoming his initial caution. The paper his sister held appeared to be a handwritten letter, with an elegant and familiar script. "Wait a minute," said Caleb, taking the letter from Chloe's hands. "I know this handwriting." The two exchanged a silent glance for a moment, a mutual recognition passing between them. It was the handwriting of Grandpa Arthur, the man who had vanished from their lives when Caleb was just 7 and Chloe was 4. "This can't be," murmured Caleb, his voice laden with a mix of surprise and something that seemed like hope. "Grandpa abandoned the family. Mom always said he left because he couldn't handle the responsibility anymore." Chloe picked up other papers from the table, examining each one with growing interest. Among the documents were contracts, correspondence, and even some black and white photographs. "Caleb, look at this," said Chloe, handing a letter to her brother. "It's written to someone named Dr. Maxwell. He talks about protecting the land for future generations, and that they must not find out about the agreement." Caleb read the letter in silence, his expression gradually shifting from skepticism to concern. His grandfather's words suggested there was much more behind his departure than the family had ever told. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. "Chloe, we shouldn't be messing with this," said Caleb, but his voice no longer held its earlier firmness. "If Grandpa really wrote this, then—" "Then what?" interrupted Chloe, already picking up other documents. "Then maybe the family has been lying to us all these years." One of the letters especially caught Chloe's attention. In it, her grandfather wrote to someone about having discovered irregularities in the property deeds and mentioned he was gathering evidence to prove they tried to cheat me. "Caleb, sit here with me," said Chloe, pulling an old chair that was leaning against the wall. "Let's read this carefully." Reluctantly, Caleb sat beside his sister, and they began to examine the papers more carefully. Among the documents was a letter that seemed never to have been sent, addressed to a lawyer in the neighboring town. "Dr. Maxwell, I urgently need your help. I have discovered that my older brother, Howard, is trying to take the property from me through maneuvers I don't fully understand. He brought papers I don't recognize and said our father had made agreements before he passed. But I always took care of this land alongside Dad, and there was never any talk of dividing or selling anything. Something is very wrong." The letter continued, detailing suspicions about forged documents and witnesses who had allegedly been paid to confirm false versions of family agreements. Their grandfather mentioned having started investigating on his own, gathering evidence and talking to people who had known the family for decades. "Howard, isn't that Uncle Gregory's father's name?" asked Chloe, looking at Caleb. "Yes, it is." "Howard was Grandpa Arthur's brother," confirmed Caleb, a dark expression taking over his face. "Chloe, if this is true—" "If it's true, our family has been lying to us our whole lives," Chloe finished, feeling a knot form in her throat. They continued reading, discovering that their grandfather had documented several attempts to talk to his brother about the inconsistencies he had found. In one of the letters, he described how Howard would always change the subject or make excuses to postpone these conversations. "I'm starting to suspect my own brother is involved in something dishonest. Yesterday I found documents at the land registry office that I had never seen before, with signatures I don't remember making. When I questioned the clerk, he got nervous and said he couldn't talk about it." Chloe felt a chill run down her spine. If her grandfather's suspicions were true, it would mean the entire official story about his disappearance was an elaborate lie to hide something much worse. "Caleb, we need to show this to Mom," said Chloe, gathering some of the most important papers. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," replied Caleb, visibly disturbed by the discoveries. "What if it's all Grandpa's invention? What if he really had mental problems like they always said?" Chloe stopped organizing the papers and looked directly at her brother. "Caleb, do you remember what Grandpa Arthur was like? Do you remember any strange behavior from him?" Caleb fell silent for a few moments, trying to recall childhood memories. Slowly, images began to form in his mind. His grandfather working in the small workshop behind the house, always organized and meticulous, teaching Caleb how to use tools and patiently explaining how to fix broken things. "I remember him as a normal person," admitted Caleb reluctantly. "Hard-working, affectionate with us. I never saw anything that indicated madness." "Exactly. And look at the organization of these papers, Caleb. Look how everything is documented with dates, names, specific details. This doesn't seem like the work of someone with mental problems," argued Chloe, gesturing toward the table full of organized documents. Caleb picked up one of the photographs that was among the papers. The black and white image showed the property decades ago, but with a completely different appearance from the arid land they had found. In the photo, there were green crops, some buildings that no longer existed, and grazing cattle. "Chloe, look at this," said Caleb, showing the photo to his sister. "This property was once very different from what it is today." In the photo, they could see Grandpa Arthur standing next to a man they didn't recognize, both in front of one of the buildings. The two men seemed to be discussing something serious, their expressions tense and formal. "Who could this other man be?" asked Chloe, examining the photo more closely. "I don't know, but by his clothes and posture, he seems like someone important. Maybe a lawyer or a government official," speculated Caleb. They found other similar photos, always showing their grandfather in seemingly serious conversations with different people. On one of them, dated 1986, there was a note on the back, "Last meeting with witnesses before everything fell apart." "Caleb, what do you think happened here?" asked Chloe, her voice laden with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "I don't know, Chloe, but I'm starting to suspect the story we were always told isn't true," admitted Caleb, putting the photo in his pocket. The sun was already beginning to dip toward the horizon when the siblings decided to take some of the most important documents home. They covered the table again with the tarp and made sure everything was left as they had found it. During the drive back to town, they traveled in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the day's discoveries. Chloe watched the landscape through the car window, imagining how that land had been a prosperous farm decades ago. "We need to talk to Mom today," said Chloe, as they were arriving at the house where Susan, the mother of the two, had lived alone since she was widowed 5 years earlier. "Chloe, let's take it easy. We don't want to scare or upset you unnecessarily," Caleb said, parking the car in front of the simple but well-kept house where they had grown up. Susan was in the kitchen preparing dinner when the two arrived. At 58, she maintained a youthful appearance and the energy that had always characterized her optimistic personality. She had worked as a teacher at the local school for over 30 years and was respected by everyone in the community. "You're early today," Susan commented, smiling as she saw her children. "How is it at Grandma Martha's property?" Chloe and Caleb exchanged a look, a silent communication passing between them about how to approach the subject. "Mom, we found something interesting there," Chloe began, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. "There's a shed on the property that you never mentioned." Susan's expression changed subtly, a flicker of what might have been nervousness passing through her eyes before returning to normal. "A shed? Oh yes, I think I vaguely remember my mother mentioning something about an old structure on the land. It's probably nothing important," Susan replied, turning back to stir the pot on the stove. "Mom, there were documents inside, letters written by Grandpa Arthur," said Caleb, watching his mother's reaction closely. This time the change in Susan's expression was more evident. She dropped the spoon she was using and slowly turned to face her children. "What kind of documents?" she asked, her voice slightly tense. Chloe took one of the letters from her bag and placed it on the table. "Letters where he talks about problems with the property, about suspicions that someone was trying to cheat him." Susan approached the table and picked up the letter, with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. She read in silence, her expression growing darker with each line. "My children," Susan said finally, sitting down heavily in a chair. "You don't understand. Your grandfather was unwell in his later years. He saw problems where there were none, suspected everyone. But Mom, the documents seem very organized, and there are photos too, from when the property was a prosperous farm," argued Chloe. "Chloe, you were both very young at the time. You don't remember how your father and I suffered with his obsessions. He accused his own family of betrayal, made up stories about conspiracies," explained Susan, her voice heavy with an old sadness. Caleb leaned forward, studying his mother's face. "Mom, what exactly happened to Grandpa? The complete truth." Susan sighed deeply, as if carrying a weight she had held for many years. "His family, especially his brother Howard, tried to help him for a long time. But his accusations became more and more serious. He even accused Howard of forging documents, of bribing officials. It got to the point where he tried to denounce his own brother publicly," Susan recounted, her voice growing quieter. "And what happened after that?" asked Chloe, sensing they were getting to the core of the truth. "Howard suggested that Arthur needed professional help. There was a clinic specializing in mental disorders in Chicago. Arthur was admitted there for treatment, Susan revealed, avoiding her children's gaze. Admitted, repeated Caleb, surprised. We always thought he had simply gone away. It was easier to explain it that way to young children. The truth was too painful, Susan justified. Chloe felt as if the ground were moving beneath her feet. Mom, is he still alive? Susan shook her head slowly. No, dear. He passed away at the clinic a few years later. We didn't talk about it because it was too painful for the whole family. The three of them sat in silence for several minutes, each processing the revelations in different ways. Caleb was trying to reorganize in his mind the entire family history he thought he knew, while Chloe felt a mix of anger and sadness over the missed opportunity to know her grandfather better. Mum, what clinic was that? Asked Chloe finally. It was called... Susan hesitated for a moment. St. Jude's Medical Haven, but it was closed many years ago due to administrative problems. What kind of problems? Insisted Caleb. I don't know exactly. I heard there were irregularities, but I never looked into it. It was a very difficult time for the whole family, replied Susan, rising from the table as if wanting to end the conversation. Chloe and Caleb exchanged glances again. Their mother's words, instead of clarifying the situation, only raised more questions. If the clinic had been closed due to irregularities, wouldn't that somehow validate the suspicions their grandfather had documented? Mom, can we see more documents related to Grandpa's hospitalization? Medical records, anything like that? Asked Chloe. Chloe, please, said Susan, her voice laden with pleading. Let the past be. You have your lives ahead of you. You don't need to carry these old pains. But Mom, what if he was right? What if there really was something wrong going on? Insisted Chloe. Susan turned abruptly, her patience finally running out. Chloe, enough! Your grandfather was sick, period. His fantasies caused enough suffering for the whole family. I won't allow you to relive all of that. The vehemence in their mother's voice surprised both siblings. Susan rarely raised her voice, and when she did, it was because something had touched a very sensitive nerve. It's okay, Mom, said Caleb, in an attempt to calm the situation. We don't want to cause more suffering. It's just that finding those documents made us curious, that's all. Susan took a deep breath, visibly trying to compose herself. I understand, my children, but sometimes it's better to leave certain things buried in the past. That night, Chloe had trouble sleeping. Her grandfather's words in the letters echoed in her mind, mixed with her mother's hesitant explanations. She couldn't shake the feeling that there were important pieces of the puzzle that still hadn't been revealed. Caleb, on the other hand, tried to convince himself that his mother was right. Perhaps it was better to accept the official version of events and move on with their lives. After all, even if there were irregularities in the past, what could be done about it decades later? The next day, Chloe woke up determined to go back to the shed alone. She didn't want to pressure Caleb, who was clearly torn between curiosity and the desire to keep family peace. During breakfast, she made up an excuse about needing to return to the property to measure some areas they had forgotten the day before. The morning sun wasn't too strong yet when Chloe arrived at the property. She parked the car in the same spot as the previous day and walked determinedly toward the shed. This time she had brought a flashlight to better examine the documents that were in darker areas of the structure. Upon entering the shed, Chloe had the impression that some things had changed since the day before. Some of the boxes seemed to have been moved, and she could swear the tarp on the table was slightly different from how they had left it. Turning on the flashlight, she began systematically examining each box in the shed. Most contained old tools, parts of farm equipment, and some personal items that seemed to have belonged to her grandfather. In one of the more remote boxes, Chloe found a collection of photographs that told the visual history of the property over the years. The oldest photos showed the land being prepared for agriculture, followed by images of crops growing, livestock being introduced, and buildings being erected. But there was a series of photos that especially caught her attention. They showed meetings between her grandfather and various different people, all dated between 1985 and 1987. In some, you could see documents being examined on tables, people pointing at papers, and serious expressions on every face. One specific photo made Chloe stop completely. In it, Grandpa Arthur was sitting at a table, surrounded by three men in suits. One of the men was holding a pen and seemed to be explaining something on a document. What caught Chloe's attention was the expression on her grandfather's face. It wasn't one of confusion or mental disorientation, but of someone who was paying close attention and trying to understand something complicated. "This doesn't look like the behavior of someone mentally unstable," Chloe murmured to herself. She kept searching until she found a small wooden box hidden behind one of the support beams in the shed. The box was well camouflaged, as if someone had deliberately tried to hide it. Inside the box, Chloe discovered what appeared to be her grandfather's diary, along with more letters and some official documents. The diary had dated entries organized chronologically, documenting in detail Arthur's growing suspicions about irregularities in the family property. The first entry Chloe read took her breath away. March 15th, 1985. Today, I discovered something that deeply disturbed me. While organizing the papers Dad left when he passed, I found documents that completely contradict the agreements Howard said existed. According to Dad's original papers, the property should be divided equally between the two of us. But the documents Howard showed indicate he is entitled to 70% of the land. How is this possible? Chloe kept reading, discovering that her grandfather had spent months trying to understand how the official documents had changed. He described visits to the land registry office, conversations with neighbors who knew the family's original agreements, and even consultations with independent lawyers. July 10th, 1985. I spoke with Mr. Otis today, who worked at the land registry office when Dad registered the will. He told me, somewhat awkwardly, that he remembers different documents being presented a few months after Dad's death. When I asked for details, he quickly changed the subject. I'm beginning to suspect that someone may have replaced the original documents. The diary entries became progressively more detailed and organized, showing that Arthur was conducting a methodical and careful investigation. He had created a documentation system that included dates, witness names, photocopies of documents, and even small maps showing the original property divisions versus the new divisions being proposed. September 22nd, 1985. I made an alarming discovery today. I obtained a copy of the original documents through a senior employee at the land registry office. When I compared them to the documents Howard has been using, the differences are glaring. The signatures don't match, the dates are altered, and there are even differences in the description of the property boundaries. There's no doubt someone forged the official documents. Chloe felt her heart race. If her grandfather's words were true, then he hadn't been a victim of paranoid delusions, but rather of an elaborate and well-executed fraud. She continued reading, discovering that Arthur had tried to confront Howard about his findings, but that his brother always made excuses to postpone conversations or change the subject when the topic was brought up. November 15th, 1985. I tried to talk to Howard for the third time about the inconsistencies in the documents. This time he became visibly nervous and said I was seeing problems where there aren't any. When I showed him the photocopies of the original documents, he said they must be old versions and that the lawyers had already updated everything according to the law. But when I asked to see these new documents, he said they were kept at the bank and it would be complicated to access them. The entries also showed that Arthur had begun to suspect other people were involved in the fraud. He mentioned land registry office employees who became evasive when questioned, neighbors who changed the subject when he tried to confirm details about the family agreements, and even some distant cousins who seemed to know information that hadn't been shared with him. January 8, 1986. I spoke today with Cousin Daisy, Uncle George's daughter. She casually mentioned that she had heard Howard talking to her husband about wrapping up the property matter quickly before anyone got suspicious. When I asked what she meant, she became embarrassed and said she had gotten confused, but the expression on her face made it clear she knew something. Chloe realized she had been reading the diary for hours, completely absorbed by her grandfather's detailed narrative. The sun was already high, and she knew Caleb was probably wondering where she was. But there was another part of the diary that had caught her attention. In the last entries, Arthur's tone changed from investigative to worried and finally to downright frightened. April 20th, 1987. Something very strange happened today. I arrived home and found signs that someone had been here during my absence. Some of my documents were out of place, and I'm sure I left the desk drawer locked. When I asked the neighbors, no one saw anything suspicious. I'm starting to feel watched. May 12th, 1987. My suspicions are confirmed. Someone is watching me. Today I saw the same strange car for the third time this week, always parked in spots where it can observe my house. When I tried to approach, the car left quickly. I am keeping the most important documents in safe places away from home. The last entry in the diary was dated just 2 weeks before the date when, according to the family, Arthur had been admitted. May 25, 1987. The situation is deteriorating rapidly. Howard showed up here today accompanied by 2 men he introduced as family lawyers. They said they were concerned about my mental state and suggested I should rest a bit at a specialized clinic. When I refused, one of them mentioned he had legal authorization to commit me involuntarily if necessary. I'm hiding this diary and all the important documents. If something happens to me, I hope someone in the family finds this evidence one day and discovers the truth. Chloe stood still for several minutes after finishing reading, trying to process the magnitude of what she had discovered. If the diary was true, then her grandfather hadn't simply developed mental problems. He had been the victim of an elaborate family conspiracy that included document fraud, intimidation, and finally forced commitment to silence him. She photographed the most important pages of the diary with her cell phone and carefully stored the wooden box back in the same place where she had found it. She knew she needed to share these discoveries with Caleb, but she also knew he would be even more disturbed than she was. During the drive back to town, Chloe couldn't stop thinking about the implications of what she had read. If Grandpa was right about the document fraud, it meant part of the property that should have belonged to the family had been stolen decades ago. Even more seriously, it meant that Arthur had been unjustly committed to prevent him from exposing the truth. When she got home, she found Caleb in the living room working on his laptop. He looked up as she entered, an expression of concern on his face. "Chloe, where were you? I tried calling several times," said Caleb, closing the laptop. "I went back to the shed. Caleb, you need to see what I found," said Chloe, sitting down next to her brother on the sofa. She showed him the photos of the diary on her phone, explaining where she had found the hidden box and summarizing the most important discoveries. Caleb listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "My God, Chloe," said Caleb when she finished explaining. "If this is true—" "It is true, Caleb. Look at the level of detail, the dates, the names. This isn't the work of someone with mental problems," argued Chloe. Caleb stood up and began pacing the room, a look of agitation on his face. "Chloe, do you understand the implications of this? If Grandpa was right, it means our family lied to us all these years. It means he was unjustly committed. It means part of our inheritance was stolen." "Exactly. And it means the people responsible are still alive and may have benefited from this fraud for decades," added Chloe. "Uncle Gregory," said Caleb, connecting the dots. "He's Howard's son. If his father really stole part of the property, then Uncle Gregory probably knows everything," completed Chloe. The 2 siblings fell silent for a few minutes, each processing the possibility that a close relative could be involved in a fraud that had destroyed their grandfather's life. "Chloe, we need to be very careful with this," said Caleb finally. "If these accusations are true, we're talking about serious crimes, and if they're false, we could destroy family relationships based on unfounded suspicions." "I know, Caleb, but we can't just ignore what we found. Grandpa deserves for the truth to come out," argued Chloe. "I agree, but we need more evidence before accusing anyone," said Caleb, sitting back down. "Let's research that clinic where he was committed. If it was really closed down for irregularities, that would already be an indication something was wrong." Chloe agreed with her brother's proposal. They spent the rest of the afternoon researching online about St. Jude's Medical Haven, but found only limited information. There were a few mentions in old newspapers about the clinic being closed in the 1990s due to administrative problems and patient rights violations, but the details were vague. "This is strange," commented Caleb, analyzing the search results. For a clinic that operated for over a decade, there's very little information available. It's as if someone deliberately erased the records, suggested Chloe. Or as if the clinic operated irregularly from the start, added Caleb. That night, during dinner, the siblings tried to broach the subject again with Susan, but more subtly. Chloe casually asked if their mother had any information about what happened to their grandfather's medical records after the clinic was closed. "Why do you want to know about that?" asked Susan, her defensiveness immediately triggered. "Just curiosity, Mom. We found some information online about the clinic being closed for irregularities," explained Caleb. Susan looked visibly uncomfortable. "I don't know the details. When we found out the clinic had closed, it had been a long time since your grandfather had passed. We saw no reason to investigate further. But, Mom, if there were irregularities, maybe Grandpa was mistreated there. Wouldn't it be important to know?" insisted Chloe. "Chloe, please," said Susan, her voice showing signs of exasperation. "You're picking at wounds that took years to heal. It doesn't matter what happened at the clinic. It won't bring your grandfather back or change the suffering the whole family went through." "But it could change our understanding of what really happened," argued Chloe. Susan stood up from the table abruptly, her patience clearly worn thin. "Enough. I forbid you from continuing with this obsession about the past. You're starting to sound exactly like him in his last years, seeing conspiracies and problems where none exist." Her mother's words hit Chloe like a punch to the stomach. The comparison to her grandfather, which should have been a compliment, sounded like an accusation of mental instability. "Mom, it's not an obsession. It's concrete evidence," said Chloe, trying to stay calm. "Evidence," repeated Susan, her voice laden with sarcasm. "Old papers in an abandoned shed. Letters from a man who was clearly disturbed. That's not evidence, Chloe. Those are the delusions of a sick mind." Caleb tried to intervene to calm the situation. "Mum, we just want to understand." "There's nothing to understand," interrupted Susan. "Your grandfather was sick. The family did the best we could at the time. End of story." She left the kitchen, leaving the two siblings alone with their own doubts and the growing conviction that there was much more to the story than their mother was willing to reveal. "Caleb," said Chloe, after they heard their mother's bedroom door slam. "Her reaction isn't normal. Why so much resistance to simply talking about it? I don't know, Chloe. Maybe it's truly painful for her, or maybe she knows things she's not telling us," completed Chloe. Caleb nodded slowly. The possibility that their own mother might be hiding important information was disturbing, but her evasive reactions made that hypothesis increasingly likely. That night, Chloe had trouble sleeping again. The words from her grandfather's diary echoed in her mind, mixed with her mother's defensive reactions. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting closer to a truth that many people preferred to keep buried. The next day, Chloe decided to take a different approach. Instead of trying to confront the family directly with her discoveries, she resolved to investigate independently. She started by making a list of all the people mentioned in her grandfather's diary who might still be alive. The first name on the list was Otis, the land registry office clerk, who had worked at the time of the events described in the diary. Chloe discovered through a quick search that he was still alive and living in a nursing home in the neighboring town. Without telling Caleb or her mother, Chloe drove to the nursing home the following morning. She introduced herself as Arthur's granddaughter and asked to speak with Mr. Otis about some matters related to the family property. Otis was an 82-year-old man, his mind still lucid, despite his advanced age. When Chloe mentioned her grandfather's name, she could see an immediate change in the old man's expression. "Arthur Harrison," murmured Otis, shaking his head slowly. "It's been a long time since I've heard that name." "Do you remember him?" asked Chloe, sitting in a chair beside the old man's bed. "Of course I remember. Arthur was a good man, hard-working. It was a shame what happened to him," said Otis, his voice carrying a genuine sadness. "What do you mean by what happened?" asked Chloe, feeling her heart race. "Mr." Otis looked around as if checking if anyone else was listening, before answering. "Young lady, your grandfather was the victim of a great injustice. I saw with my own eyes what they did to him." "Can you tell me about it?" asked Chloe, trying to keep her voice calm despite her anxiety. Arthur was right about the documents. I saw when the original papers were replaced. I saw when the signatures were forged. But I was just a simple clerk at the Land Registry office. I had no power to do anything, recounted Mr. Otis, his voice trembling with emotion. Chloe felt as if the world was spinning around her. Are you sure about this? I am absolutely certain. Howard, his brother, came to the Land Registry office several times with different lawyers. They brought new documents and asked to replace the ones that were filed. They said there were errors in the originals that needed to be corrected, explained Mr. Otis. And you didn't question it? Asked Chloe. I did question it, but they told me it was all legal, that it had judicial approval. They showed papers with official stamps. I was just a clerk. I had no way to verify the authenticity of everything, justified Mr. Otis, visibly disturbed by the memory. What else do you remember from that time? Insisted Chloe. Mr. Otis was silent for a few moments, as if organizing old memories. I remember that Arthur came to the Land Registry office frequently in his last months, trying to understand the changes in the documents. He brought photographs of the original papers and compared them with what was on file. With each visit, he became more agitated and worried. And what happened after that? Asked Chloe. One day Arthur stopped showing up. When I asked about him, they told me he had been admitted to a clinic because he had mental problems, but I knew that wasn't true. Arthur was lucid. He was investigating a real fraud, said Mr. Otis, shaking his head sadly. Chloe felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. The independent confirmation of her grandfather's suspicions made the injustice even more real and painful. Why did you never say anything? She asked, trying not to sound accusatory. Who was I going to tell? Howard was an influential person in town. He had powerful lawyers. I was just a low-level public servant. Who would believe me against them? Explained Mr. Otis, his voice laden with regret. But do you still remember the details? Could you testify about what you saw? Asked Chloe, an idea beginning to form in her mind. Mr. Otis looked her directly in the eyes. Young lady, I have carried this guilt for decades. If there is a way to get justice for your grandfather, even after all this time I am willing to help. Chloe left St. Jude's Medical Haven with a mixture of validation and determination. She finally had an independent testimony that confirmed her grandfather's suspicions. But she also knew she would still need much more evidence to confront an entire family with such serious accusations. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we are just starting out. Now continuing. On her way back home, Chloe stopped at a cafe to organize her thoughts and plan her next steps. She made a list of everything she had discovered so far. 1. Her grandfather's detailed diary documenting suspicions of fraud. 2. Photographs showing serious meetings about documents. 3. Mr. Otis's testimony confirming the replacement of documents. 4. The clinic where her grandfather was admitted was closed due to irregularities. 5. Her mother's excessive defensiveness about the subject. Each piece individually could be questioned, but together they formed a convincing picture that a serious injustice had been committed. Chloe decided she needed to talk to Caleb before taking any next steps. When she got home, she found her brother in the kitchen, making a snack. Caleb, I need to tell you something important, said Chloe, sitting down at the table. She recounted the entire conversation with Mr. Otis, watching as Caleb's expression changed from skepticism to shock, and finally to contained anger. My God, Chloe, said Caleb when she finished, if this is true, our family was built on a lie. Not our whole family, Caleb. It seems our mother was also deceived. She was very young at the time and probably believed the version they told her, argued Chloe. But she still defends that version even now when we have evidence to the contrary, pointed out Caleb. Maybe because it's too painful to admit she spent her whole life believing a lie about her own father, suggested Chloe. Caleb was silent for a few minutes, processing all the implications of the situation. Chloe, what are we going to do with this information? I don't know yet, but I know we can't just ignore it. No, Grandpa deserves for the truth to be known, replied Chloe. And Uncle Gregory, he must know something. If his father was really responsible for the fraud, began Caleb. Then maybe it's time to talk to him directly, completed Chloe. The two siblings decided they would try to approach Gregory casually, without direct accusations, to see how he would react when the subject of the inherited property was mentioned. Gregory Harrison was a 65-year-old man, Susan's younger brother, who worked as a merchant in town. He had always maintained a cordial relationship with his niece and nephew, though he wasn't particularly close. Since his sister-in-law Martha's death, he had shown interest in helping with matters related to the inheritance. The following afternoon, Chloe and Caleb visited Gregory at his hardware store. They began the conversation talking about the inheritance paperwork and the difficulties of dealing with old properties. "Have you decided what you're going to do with Grandma Martha's land?" asked Gregory, organizing some papers behind the counter. "We're still weighing our options," replied Caleb. "The property is larger than we thought." "Ah, yes, that land was always extensive. In your grandfather Arthur's time it was a very prosperous farm," Gregory commented casually. Chloe and Caleb exchanged quick glances. It was the first time someone in the family had spontaneously mentioned the property's former prosperity. "Do you remember that time well?" asked Chloe. Gregory stopped organizing the papers and looked at his niece with a slightly cautious expression. "I remember some things. Why do you ask?" "It's just that we found some old photos on the property. They show it looking very different from today," explained Caleb. "Old photos," repeated Gregory, his voice carrying a nearly imperceptible note of tension. "Yes, and also some old documents. They seem to be from Grandpa Arthur," added Chloe, watching her uncle's reaction closely. The change in Gregory's expression was subtle but noticeable. He straightened up and crossed his arms, adopting a defensive posture. "What kind of documents?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Letters, mostly. He wrote about issues related to the property," replied Chloe vaguely. "Kids," said Gregory, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "you need to understand that your grandfather was having mental problems in his later years. Anything he wrote during that time shouldn't be taken too seriously." Gregory's response was almost identical to their mother's words, as if it were a rehearsed version of the family's official story. "But Uncle, the documents seem very organized." "And there are photos too, showing meetings about important papers," insisted Caleb. Gregory looked visibly uncomfortable. "Caleb, Chloe, you don't understand the pain this situation caused the whole family. Arthur accused innocent people of terrible things. He almost destroyed family relationships with his obsessions." "Who did he accuse?" asked Chloe directly. He accused my father of falsifying documents, said the family was trying to steal his property. They were completely unfounded accusations that caused a lot of suffering," revealed Gregory, his voice heavy with an emotion that could be sadness or guilt. "And what if they weren't unfounded?" asked Chloe, deciding to be more direct. Gregory looked at her with surprise and then with an expression that could be interpreted as irritation or fear. "Chloe, are you serious? Are you suggesting my father, who cared for Arthur like a brother his whole life, would be capable of such a thing?" said Gregory, his voice rising slightly. "We're not suggesting anything, Uncle. We're just trying to understand what really happened," explained Caleb, trying to calm the situation. "What happened was a family tragedy. Arthur was sick and created fantasies in his mind. My father did everything he could to help, including arranging medical treatment when necessary," said Gregory, his version of the story aligning perfectly with what Susan had told. Chloe felt a wave of frustration. It was as if the whole family had memorized the same version of events and refused to consider any alternative possibility. "Uncle Gregory," said Chloe, deciding to try a different approach, "would you be able to tell us where the original documents for the division of the property between Grandpa Arthur and your father are?" The question caught Gregory off guard. He hesitated for a few seconds before answering. "I don't know. I imagine they're with the family lawyers or at the land registry office," he replied, but his hesitation didn't go unnoticed by his niece and nephew. "Would it be possible to see those documents?" insisted Caleb. "What for?" asked Gregory, his defensiveness becoming more obvious. "To better understand the inheritance we received. We want to make sure everything is in order," explained Chloe. Gregory was silent for a few moments, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Look, kids," he said finally, "you're stirring up very delicate matters. If you want advice from someone who lived through that time, let the past rest and focus on the future. Sell the property, split the money, and get on with your lives." "Why the rush for us to sell the property?" asked Chloe, a suspicion beginning to form in her mind. "It's not a rush. It's practicality. You're young. You have your lives in the city. Why carry the burden of a rural property that will only bring work and expenses?" justified Gregory. "But what if the property is worth more than we think? What if there are unresolved legal issues related to the inheritance?" insisted Caleb. Gregory looked at them directly, his expression becoming more serious and slightly threatening. "Caleb, Chloe, I'm going to tell you something. If you keep digging into these past issues, you might end up discovering things that will hurt a lot of people in the family. Sometimes it's better to let certain things stay buried," he said, his voice carrying a clear tone of warning. The veiled threat in Gregory's words surprised both siblings. It was as if he was indirectly confirming that there really were family secrets that should remain hidden. "Uncle, why are you talking like this?" asked Chloe, trying to keep her voice calm. "Because I worry about you, and because I've seen what these obsessions with the past can do to a person," replied Gregory, but his explanation didn't sound convincing. Caleb and Chloe left the store with more questions than answers, but with a growing conviction that they were on the right track. The defensive reaction and warnings from Gregory only reinforced their suspicions that there really was something to be hidden. On the way home, they discussed the available options. They could try to confront other family members directly, but they would probably get similar responses. They could seek legal help, but they still didn't have enough concrete evidence for a lawsuit. "Chloe," said Caleb as they were arriving home, "I think we need to go back to the shed and look for more evidence. If Grandpa was really investigating a fraud, he must have kept more things besides what we've already found." Chloe agreed. They decided they would spend the next weekend doing a systematic search of the entire shed, looking for other hiding spots or documents that might have gone unnoticed. On Saturday morning, the two siblings returned to the property equipped with powerful flashlights, gloves, and tools in case they needed to move heavy objects. This time, they were determined to examine every inch of the shed. They started at one end of the structure, systematically moving each box, examining every tool, and checking behind every support beam. The work was slow and dusty, but both were motivated by the possibility of finding more pieces of the puzzle. It was Caleb who made the next important discovery. While moving a pile of old tools leaning against the back wall, he noticed that one of the metal wall panels was slightly loose. "Chloe, come look at this," called Caleb, trying to loosen the panel further. With some effort, they managed to remove the panel completely, revealing a small hollow space between the shed walls. Inside the space was a rusty metal box, carefully wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture. "My God," murmured Chloe as Caleb removed the box from the hiding spot. "Grandpa really hid things here." The box was locked, but the lock had rusted over the years. With a tool found in the shed itself, Caleb managed to force it until it opened with a metallic click. Inside the box, they found a collection of documents that left them both breathless. There were photocopies of the original property division documents, exactly as Arthur had described in his diary. There were also photographs of signatures being compared, showing the differences between the original and the forged documents. But the most impressive was a set of cassette tape recordings, carefully labeled with dates and descriptions of the content. "Caleb, look at this," said Chloe, picking up one of the tapes. "It says Conversation with Howard, Dro 3/15, 1987, proof of knowledge about the fraud." Caleb picked up an old tape recorder that was in one of the shed's boxes and, after a few attempts, managed to get it to work. They put in the first tape and pressed play. The voice of their grandfather Arthur came from the device, clear and lucid, suggesting no mental problems whatsoever. He was talking to someone who was clearly his brother, Howard. "Howard, I need you to explain to me how these documents are different from the ones Dad showed us before he died." "Arthur, you're seeing problems where there aren't any. The lawyers just updated the papers according to the new laws." "What new laws?" And why has my share of the property shrunk so much compared to what was in the original document? Arthur, you're confused. The original document was never different from this. Howard, I have photocopies of the document Dad showed us. The divisions were different, the signatures are different, even the dates don't match. There was a long pause in the recording, followed by Howard's voice sounding noticeably nervous. Arthur, where did you get these photocopies? Who's putting these ideas in your head? No one is putting any ideas. I went to the land registry office myself and compared the documents. Can you explain to me why there are two completely different versions? Another pause, even longer. Arthur, I think you need professional help. You're seeing conspiracies where there aren't any. You're accusing your own family of terrible things. Howard, I just want to understand the truth. If there's nothing wrong, why can't you show me the original documents Dad signed? Because they're kept in a safe place, and because I'm worried about your mental state. The recording continued, but Chloe and Caleb had already heard enough to confirm their worst suspicions. The conversation made it clear that Arthur had confronted Howard with concrete evidence of alterations to the documents, and that Howard had been unable to provide convincing explanations. Caleb, said Chloe, her voice trembling with emotion, this proves Grandpa was right. Howard knew about the fraud and couldn't explain the inconsistencies. Caleb nodded, but his expression was grim. Chloe, this also proves that the whole family conspired to commit Grandpa when he started to uncover the truth. They listened to a few more recordings, each providing more evidence of the fraud and the increasing pressure on Arthur to stop investigating. In one of the last recordings, they could hear Arthur talking to someone who seemed to be a lawyer, discussing the possibility of a formal complaint. Dr. Maxwell, I have all the evidence needed to prove there was document forgery. What do I need to do to start a legal process? Arthur, this is very serious. Forging inheritance documents is a grave crime, but are you absolutely certain of these accusations? I have all the proof, photocopies of the original documents, witnesses who saw the substitution happen, evidence that the signatures were forged. Then let's proceed, but you need to be prepared for the consequences. Accusing a family member of a crime is something that can permanently divide the family. Dr. Maxwell, the family was already divided when they decided to steal from me. Now I just want justice to be done. The recording ended abruptly, as if it had been cut off mid-conversation. Chloe and Caleb sat in silence for several minutes after the tape stopped playing. What do you think happened after that conversation? Asked Chloe. I think that's when they decided they needed to stop Grandpa from proceeding with the complaint, replied Caleb, his voice heavy with sadness and anger. Among the documents in the box, there was also a letter that Arthur had written but apparently never sent. The letter was addressed to the grandchildren he had not yet met, explaining the whole situation and apologizing for not being able to protect the family inheritance. My dear grandchildren, if you are reading this letter, it means something happened to me before I could resolve the injustice I discovered. I want you to know that your grandfather did not abandon you by choice. I tried to protect what was rightfully ours, but greater forces conspired against me. The evidence is all here. Use it to recover what was stolen from our family and to clear my name. Remember that I love you very much, even though we didn't get the chance to know each other better. Arthur Harrison. Chloe had tears in her eyes when she finished reading the letter. The pain and love in her grandfather's words made the whole injustice even more painful to bear. Caleb, said Chloe, wiping her eyes, we can't let this go. We have to do something. I completely agree, replied Caleb, his determination evident in his voice. But we need to be strategic. If we're going to confront the entire family with this evidence, we need to be prepared for the consequences. They spent the rest of the afternoon organizing all the evidence they had found, the detailed diary, the photographs, the forged documents, the compromising recordings, and Mr. Otis's testimony. Together, this evidence painted a clear and convincing picture of family fraud, followed by wrongful institutionalization to silence the victim. Chloe, said Caleb, as they were organizing the materials, this goes beyond a simple matter of inheritance. If these accusations are brought to the authorities, people could face criminal charges. And they should, replied Chloe firmly. Grandpa was the victim of serious crimes. We can't let those responsible continue unpunished. But we also have to think about Mum. If all this is true, it means she spent decades believing a lie about her own father. This will devastate her, Caleb pointed out. Chloe considered her brother's words. It was true the revelations would cause a lot of suffering for Susan, but continuing to live based on a lie didn't seem fair either. Caleb, our mother is a strong person. She deserves to know the truth about her own father, even if it's painful, argued Chloe. I agree, but we need to approach this very carefully, said Caleb. They decided the first step would be to seek professional legal help. They needed to know if the evidence they had found would be enough for a case and what the necessary procedures would be to clear their grandfather's name and recover the property that had been stolen. On Monday morning, Chloe and Caleb went to the most respected law firm in town. They scheduled a consultation with Mr. Julian Vance, a lawyer specializing in family law and property crimes. Mr. Julian was a man in his 50s with a solid reputation for honesty and competence. When the siblings presented their situation, he listened with growing attention, occasionally asking specific questions about dates and details. Did you bring the evidence? Asked Mr. Julian after Caleb finished explaining the situation. Chloe and Caleb presented copies of all the documents they had found, including photographs of the recordings and transcripts of the key sections from the cassette tapes. Mr. Julian examined the material for nearly an hour, taking notes and occasionally asking questions to clarify specific points. His expression grew more serious as he analyzed each piece of evidence. You have a very strong case here, Mr. Julian finally said. If this evidence is authenticated, there is sufficient basis for proceedings in both civil and criminal areas. What exactly does that mean? Asked Caleb. In the civil area, you can sue to recover the property that was fraudulently transferred. In the criminal area, those responsible for forging documents and the wrongful institutionalization can be prosecuted, explained the lawyer. Even after so much time? Asked Chloe. For crimes of this magnitude, the statute of limitations is long, and forced institutionalization based on fraudulent grounds can be considered kidnapping, which has an even longer statute of limitations, replied Mr. Julian. The siblings exchanged looks, both feeling the weight of the implications of what they were discovering. Mr. Vance, said Caleb, what would be the first step? First, we need to authenticate all this evidence through experts. Then we can initiate an action to annul the fraudulent property transfers. Simultaneously, we can file a criminal complaint against those responsible, explained Mr. Julian. How long would this take? Asked Chloe. Cases involving old fraud and inheritance issues can take years. But with evidence as solid as this, there's a good chance of success, replied the lawyer. And the costs? Asked Caleb, ever practical. I can work on a contingency fee basis. If we recover the property, my fees come from the recovered value. If we get nothing, you only pay the court costs, offered Mr. Julian Vance. Chloe and Caleb asked for a few days to think about the proposal and talk to the family about their discoveries. They knew that once they started the legal process, there would be no turning back. That night, the siblings met with Susan in the kitchen of the family home. They had decided to present all the evidence at once, allowing their mother to make her own decisions based on the full facts. Mom, began Chloe, we need to talk to you about Grandpa Arthur. We found evidence that completely changes our understanding of what happened to him. Susan sighed, resigned. I knew you wouldn't let this go. Mum, Grandpa wasn't sick. He was investigating a real estate fraud involving the family property, said Caleb, placing the organized documents on the table. For the next hour, the siblings methodically presented all the evidence, the diary, the photographs, the recordings, Mr. Otis's testimony, and the lawyer's confirmation that there were legal grounds for a lawsuit. Susan listened in silence, her expression gradually changing from skepticism to shock, then to sadness, and finally to a contained anger. My children, said Susan when they finished, her voice trembling, are you telling me my father was the victim of a family fraud, that he was unjustly committed to silence him, and that I spent 40 years believing he was insane? That's exactly it, Mum, confirmed Chloe, taking Susan's hand. Susan was silent for several minutes, tears streaming silently down her face. How could I doubt him? How could I believe my own father was crazy? Mom, you were very young at the time. All the adults in the family confirmed the same story. You had no way of knowing, comforted Caleb. But I should have questioned more. I should have investigated. I should have visited him at the clinic, lamented Susan. Mum, what matters now is that we finally know the truth, and we can seek justice, said Chloe. Susan looked at her children with a determination they had rarely seen in her eyes. Do it. Sue everyone responsible. Recover the property that was stolen. Clear my father's name, she said firmly. I should have done this decades ago. The decision was made. The next day, Chloe and Caleb returned to Mr. Julian Vance's office and formalized the hiring of his services. The quest for justice had finally begun. The following weeks were intense and emotionally draining for the whole family. Mr. Julian Vance began the process of authenticating the evidence, sending the documents to handwriting experts and the audio equipment to recording authenticity specialists. Simultaneously, he began investigating the official records from that time, looking for inconsistencies in the Land Registry Office files and documents related to Arthur's commitment to the psychiatric clinic. Chloe and Caleb received the first good news 2 weeks after hiring the lawyer. The experts confirmed that the alterations in the property documents were evident and that the signatures on the forged documents did not match the authentic samples of Arthur's handwriting. The evidence of forgery is irrefutable, informed Mr. Julian Vance during a meeting in his office. We have a solid basis to annul all the transfers based on these fraudulent documents. The second confirmation came from audio experts who validated the authenticity of the recordings and confirmed there were no signs of editing or manipulation on the tapes. The recorded conversations are valid legal evidence, explained Mr. Julian Vance. They clearly document the involved parties' knowledge of the fraud and the attempts to silence the victim. As the legal process unfolded, news of the investigation inevitably reached the other family members. Gregory was the first to confront his siblings about their actions. He showed up at Susan's house on a Thursday afternoon, visibly agitated and confrontational. "Chloe, Caleb," Gregory said as soon as he entered the house, "I heard you hired a lawyer and are suing the family. Is that true?" "It's true, Uncle Gregory," Chloe confirmed calmly. "We found evidence that Grandpa Arthur was a victim of fraud." "You don't know what you're doing," exploded Gregory. "You're destroying the entire family based on conspiracy theories from a man who was mentally ill." "The evidence was authenticated by experts, Uncle. They're not conspiracy theories," Caleb retorted. "What evidence? Old papers anyone could have forged?" argued Gregory, but his vehemence seemed forced. Susan, who had remained silent until then, stood up and faced her brother-in-law. "Gregory," she said, her voice firm and controlled, "I heard the recordings. I heard my father confronting your father about the falsification of documents. I heard the evasions and his inability to provide convincing explanations." Gregory was visibly shaken by Susan's firm stance. "Susan, you don't understand. You weren't there to see Arthur's mental state. His accusations were becoming more and more absurd." "Absurd?" interrupted Susan, her voice rising. "Then how do you explain the differences between the original documents and the ones used to divide the property?" Gregory hesitated, clearly not expecting Susan to be so well informed about the details of the evidence. There may have been administrative errors, legal updates. That doesn't mean there was deliberate fraud," he replied, but his argument sounded weak. "Gregory," said Caleb, "your father is on tape admitting he couldn't explain the inconsistencies in the documents. If there was no fraud, why couldn't he simply show the original papers?" Gregory looked around as if searching for a way out of the situation. His defensive posture was turning into evident desperation. "You don't understand the consequences of what you're doing," he said finally. "If you continue with this, you'll destroy the reputation of innocent people. You'll cause unnecessary suffering for the whole family." "And my father's suffering," retorted Susan. "He was unjustly committed, had his sanity publicly questioned, died away from his family. Where was the concern for his suffering?" Gregory fell silent, clearly without convincing arguments to answer Susan's question. "Uncle Gregory," said Chloe, "if there really is nothing to hide, then the legal process will only confirm that. But if there is, then the truth needs to be known." "You'll regret this," said Gregory, his voice carrying a threatening tone. "Messing with the past can bring consequences you can't imagine." After Gregory's tense departure, the family realized they had definitely crossed a point of no return. The defensive reaction and vague threats only reinforced their convictions that they were on the right path. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing, in the following weeks other relatives began to take clear positions on the family conflict. Some distant cousins sided with Gregory, arguing it wasn't worth stirring up the past and causing family divisions. Others, especially the younger ones who hadn't lived through the original events, were curious about the truth and willing to support the investigation. The family rift deepened when Mr. Julian Vance gained access to the remaining records of St. Jude's Medical Haven. Through contacts in the legal field, he discovered that some clinic documents had been preserved in court archives related to the institution's closure. "You won't believe what I found," said Mr. Julian Vance during a meeting in the first week of March. "I managed to access your grandfather's admission records." He opened a folder and pulled out a copy of Arthur's admission form. "Look who signed the request for involuntary commitment." Chloe and Caleb examined the document and were shocked to see the request had been signed by Howard Harrison and two other people they didn't recognize, but who were identified as accredited physicians. "Even more interesting," continued Mr. Julian Vance, "is the psychiatric report that justified the commitment. The report described Arthur as exhibiting severe paranoid delusions, accusing family members of conspiracy, requiring immediate commitment for his own protection and that of others. The document was signed by a Dr. Winston Thorne, who was listed as the psychiatrist responsible for the evaluation. "I got information about this Dr. Thorne," said Mr. Julian Vance. "He had his medical license revoked 3 years after your grandfather's commitment for fraudulent diagnoses in exchange for payments." The information left Chloe and Caleb stunned. "You mean Grandpa was committed based on a fake psychiatric report?" asked Chloe. "Exactly, and there's more," said Mr. Julian Vance, pulling another document from the folder. "I found records showing that Arthur's medical bills for the commitment were paid in full by Howard Harrison. Not just the basic monthly fees, but also special treatments that kept Arthur sedated and isolated for much of his stay." Caleb stood up and began pacing the room, clearly agitated. "Doctor, this isn't just document fraud. This is kidnapping, false imprisonment, a series of serious crimes." "Exactly. That's why I'm recommending we also file a criminal complaint in addition to the civil lawsuit," confirmed Mr. Julian Vance. Chloe felt a mix of validation and horror. Each new piece of evidence confirmed that her grandfather had been the victim of a conspiracy even broader and crueler than they had initially imagined. "What happened to this Dr. Thorne after he lost his license?" asked Chloe. "He died 15 years ago, but I managed to locate a nurse who worked at the clinic at the time of your grandfather's commitment. He agreed to give a statement," informed Mr. Julian Vance. The nurse's testimony, recorded a few days later, provided disturbing details about the conditions of Arthur's commitment. According to the nurse, Arthur was lucid and constantly questioned why he was being kept at the clinic against his will. Mr. Arthur was different from the other patients. He didn't have strange behaviors, didn't talk to himself, didn't have visual delusions. He just insisted he had been committed unjustly and that he needed to get out to resolve important matters related to the family property, reported the nurse. The nurse also confirmed that Arthur received heavy medication that kept him sedated most of the time, and that his attempts to question the necessity of the medication were ignored by the doctors. Once, Mr. Arthur managed to go without the medication for 2 days because there was an error in administration. During those 2 days, he was completely normal, spoke coherently, made plans for when he would leave the clinic. When the doctors noticed, they increased the dosage of his medication, and he became drowsy and confused again, added the nurse. With this new evidence, Mr. Julian Vance felt confident enough to take the next step, to formally file the criminal and civil complaints. The criminal complaint was filed in a court in Chicago, where there would be less chance of local influence from Howard's family. The charges included forgery of a public document, kidnapping through fraudulent hospitalization, and conspiracy to commit crimes against property. The civil suit was filed simultaneously, seeking to annul all property transfers based on the forged documents and the restitution of the funds that should have been inherited by Arthur and his descendants. The news of the formal filing of the lawsuits spread quickly through the small town where the family lived. Reactions were varied. Some people expressed admiration for the siblings' courage in seeking the truth. Others criticized what they saw as an attempt to get rich at the expense of relatives. Gregory tried one last approach to dissuade the siblings from proceeding with the lawsuits. He appeared at Mr. Julian Vance's office, accompanied by his own lawyer, proposing an out-of-court settlement. "We are willing to negotiate a financial compensation to settle this matter without the need for a lengthy and costly lawsuit," offered Gregory's lawyer. Mr. Julian Vance consulted Chloe and Caleb, who were present at the meeting. After a brief conversation between the siblings, Chloe responded, "It's not just about the money. If it were, you would have offered a settlement before we got to the point of hiring lawyers. Now we want the truth to be known publicly and for our grandfather to have his name cleared." "Furthermore," added Caleb, "an out-of-court settlement would be like admitting the accusations are true, but that we're willing to accept money to stay silent. That's not what we want." Gregory's lawyer tried to argue about the emotional and financial costs of a prolonged lawsuit, but the siblings remained firm in their decision to proceed with the legal actions. "One last thing," said Gregory as he was leaving the meeting. "Are you sure you want to publicly expose all the details of this story? Sometimes the truth can be more painful than the lie you've lived with until now." The veiled threat in Gregory's words left Chloe and Caleb intrigued. Were there still secrets they hadn't uncovered? This question was partially answered a few weeks later, when Mr. Julian Vance gained access to more documents through the legal process. Among the papers the opposing party was compelled to provide, there was a series of correspondences between Howard and lawyers from that time, revealing the full scope of the fraud. The letters showed that the forgery of the inheritance documents had not been an isolated event. Howard had systematically defrauded several property transactions over the years, using his respected position in the community to validate altered documents. One specific letter revealed that other family members had been victims of similar practices, though on a smaller scale. Distant cousins had had their inheritance shares diminished through questionable legal maneuvers, always justified as necessary updates or corrections of administrative errors. "Chloe, Caleb," said Mr. Julian Vance, showing the letters, "you were not the only victims. Howard's family built a fortune based on systematic fraud against several relatives over decades." The discovery brought a new perspective on the magnitude of what they had uncovered. This was not just an isolated family dispute, but a pattern of criminal behavior that had affected multiple generations. "That explains why they are so desperate to stop our investigation," commented Caleb. "If all this comes to light, there could be other victims demanding justice." "Exactly," confirmed Mr. Julian Vance. "That's why I'm recommending we expand our investigation to include these other frauds. It would strengthen our case and could result in even larger compensations." Chloe and Caleb agreed with the expanded strategy. The more evidence they had, the stronger their legal position would be, and the harder it would be for the defense to deny or minimize the accusations. The legal process began to gain momentum when the prosecutor responsible for the criminal case decided to accept the complaints and initiate an official investigation. The news that public authorities were investigating the allegations gave additional credibility to the siblings' claims. The first hearing for the civil lawsuit was scheduled for May, and Chloe and Caleb knew it would be a crucial moment to present their evidence in an organized and convincing manner. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, they dedicated themselves to preparing detailed testimonies about their findings and organizing all the evidence logically and chronologically. Susan, who had initially resisted getting directly involved in the lawsuit, decided she would testify in favor of her children. Her decision to publicly support the accusations against her brother-in-law was seen as a definitive moment in the family conflict. "My children," Susan said a few days before the hearing, "I need to testify not only to support you, but to publicly ask my father for forgiveness. He deserves for me to defend his memory, just as I should have defended his sanity when he was alive." The hearing was held on a sunny May morning in the county courthouse. Chloe and Caleb arrived accompanied by Susan and Mr. Julian Vance, determined but nervous about how it would be to publicly present such serious accusations against members of their own family. Gregory arrived with 2 lawyers and some relatives who had taken his side. The tension in the courtroom was palpable when the 2 parties met for the first time since the lawsuit had begun. The judge presiding over the case, Judge Silas Whitlock, had a reputation for being fair but strict with evidence. He made it clear from the start that he would not tolerate emotional arguments and that his decision would be based strictly on the evidence presented. Mr. Julian Vance began by presenting a chronological timeline of events, from the death of Chloe and Caleb's great-grandfather to the forced hospitalization of Arthur. He used photographs, authenticated documents, and excerpts from the recordings to build a systematic and convincing case. "Your Honor," said Mr. Julian Vance, "the evidence clearly shows a pattern of fraudulent behavior that included document forgery, bribery of public officials, and, finally, psychiatric hospitalization based on fraudulent medical reports to silence the victim. The defense argued that the documents could have been forged by the plaintiffs themselves, that the recordings were of questionable authenticity, and that Arthur had indeed shown signs of mental instability that justified the hospitalization." "Your Honor," argued Gregory's lawyer, "the plaintiffs are basing their serious accusations on materials found decades after the events, with no direct witnesses to the alleged crimes. It is perfectly possible that these materials were fabricated or altered to create a narrative favorable to the plaintiffs' financial interests." The crucial moment of the hearing came when Mr. Otis was called to testify. Despite his advanced age, the former employee of the Land Registry Office gave a clear and detailed testimony about having witnessed the substitution of the original documents. "I saw it with my own eyes," said Mr. Otis, his voice firm despite his years. "Howard Harrison came to the Land Registry Office multiple times with different lawyers, always bringing new documents to replace the ones that were filed. When I questioned it, they showed me authorizations that looked official, but now I realize the entire operation was fraudulent." Mr. Otis's testimony was corroborated by the nurse from the psychiatric clinic, who confirmed that Arthur was lucid during his stay and constantly questioned why he was being kept against his will. The defense tried to discredit both testimonies, arguing they were based on old memories and possibly distorted by time. However, the consistency of the statements with the documentary evidence made their arguments less convincing. The turning point in the hearing came when the judge requested the defense to present the original documents that supposedly justified the division of the property as it had been done. "Your Honor," said Gregory's lawyer, "some of the original documents were lost over the years due to changes in the Land Registry Office and administrative updates." "And the documents that still exist," insisted the judge. After a long hesitation, the lawyer admitted that the available documents contained inconsistencies they could not adequately explain. "Your Honor, we request an additional period to locate supplementary documents that may clarify these inconsistencies," the defense pleaded. The judge granted a 30-day deadline for the defense to present additional evidence, but his expression during the hearing made it clear that the plaintiff's arguments had been more convincing. Chloe and Caleb left the hearing with a mixed feeling of relief and anxiety. The evidence had been well received by the judge, but there was still the waiting period for the final decision. During the weeks of waiting, the pressure on Gregory and the other relatives involved in the fraud intensified. The criminal investigation had found additional evidence of irregularities, and the possibility of formal criminal charges was becoming increasingly real. It was in this context that Gregory made one last attempt to resolve the situation without a formal admission of guilt. He approached Chloe and Caleb directly, without lawyers, in an attempt at a personal appeal. "Chloe, Caleb," said Gregory when he met them at Susan's house, "you got what you wanted. Everyone in town now knows the story. Your grandfather's name is being publicly cleared. Why don't we stop here?" "Because there hasn't been complete justice yet," replied Chloe. "The stolen properties haven't been returned. Those responsible for the crimes haven't been punished. And because we want this to serve as an example, so no one else tries to do something similar in the future," added Caleb. Gregory fell silent for a few moments, clearly wrestling internally with some difficult decision. "There are things about this story that you don't know," he finally said, "things that could change your perspective on everything." Chloe and Caleb exchanged glances, intrigued by Gregory's mysterious statement. "What things?" asked Chloe. "My father. Howard. He didn't act alone. There were other people involved, people with far more power and influence than our family," revealed Gregory, his voice laden with nervousness. "Who?" insisted Caleb. Gregory hesitated, as if struggling between revealing the truth and keeping secrets he had guarded for decades. "Local politicians, government officials, businessmen who wanted to develop the area. Your property was always very valuable due to its location. My father was just a piece in a much larger operation," confessed Gregory. The revelation left Chloe and Caleb stunned. If Gregory was telling the truth, then the fraud against Arthur had been part of an even broader conspiracy involving political corruption and powerful economic interests. "Why are you telling us this now?" asked Chloe, suspicious of Gregory's motives. "Because I'm afraid," admitted Gregory. "If you keep investigating and uncover the involvement of these other people, we could all be in danger. These people have a lot of power and won't hesitate to protect their interests." "Uncle Gregory," said Caleb, "if there really are powerful people involved in this, then it's even more important that the truth comes out. We can't let corruption go unpunished." "You don't understand," insisted Gregory, his voice heavy with desperation. "I'm trying to protect you. Some stones are better left unturned." Despite Gregory's warnings, Chloe and Caleb decided to inform Mr. Julian Vance about the new revelations. If there really was a larger conspiracy involving political corruption, it only strengthened the need to seek complete justice. Mr. Julian Vance received the information with professional interest, but also with caution. If Gregory is telling the truth, it could explain why the criminal investigation is finding so much support from the authorities, commented the lawyer. "Perhaps there is official interest in exposing this historical corruption." "What does this mean for our case?" asked Chloe. "It means we may have more powerful allies than we imagined, but it also means there may be forces trying to stop our investigation," explained Mr. Julian Vance. The answer came sooner than expected. The week after the conversation with Gregory, Mr. Julian Vance received a call from the prosecutor in charge of the criminal investigation. "Mr. Vance," said the prosecutor, "we have good news about the Harrison case. Our investigation has found evidence of a corruption scheme much broader than the initially reported frauds. We are preparing criminal charges against several individuals, including former public officials and local businessmen." The news confirmed Gregory's revelations about the involvement of influential people in the fraud against Arthur, but it also validated Chloe and Caleb's decision to proceed with the investigation, despite the warnings. "What will be the impact of this on our civil lawsuit?" asked Mr. Julian Vance. "Very positive," replied the prosecutor. "The criminal evidence we are gathering fully supports your civil claims. I believe the judge will be even more inclined to rule in favor of the plaintiffs." The decision from the first hearing was announced in early June. Judge Silas Whitlock issued a detailed 15-page ruling that methodically analyzed every aspect of the case. Considering the evidence presented, including authenticated documents, consistent testimonies, and recordings validated by experts, this court determines that there was unequivocal falsification of inheritance documents with the aim of defrauding Mr. Arthur Harrison of his legitimate share of the family property, wrote the judge in the ruling. The decision nullified all property transfers based on the forged documents and ordered the lands to be returned to Arthur's legitimate heirs, with financial compensation for the years of improper use. Most importantly, the ruling included an official declaration that there is no evidence to support the claim that Mr. Arthur Harrison suffered from any mental disorder justifying his involuntary commitment, this appearing to have been motivated by fraudulent objectives. Chloe had tears in her eyes as Mr. Julian Vance read the ruling aloud. Finally, 40 years after his unjust death, Grandpa Arthur had his name officially cleared and his sanity publicly recognized. "We did it," said Chloe, embracing Caleb. "Grandpa finally got justice." The legal victory was followed by immediate consequences for those responsible for the fraud. Gregory was forced to return a significant property he had inherited from his father based on the forged documents. Other relatives who had benefited from the scheme also faced restitution obligations. Even more significant was the impact of the expanded criminal investigation. In the weeks following the civil decision, several people were indicted for corruption, including a former mayor and retired officials from the Land Registry Office, who had facilitated multiple document frauds over the years. The story of Chloe and Caleb's fight for the truth became known throughout the region, inspiring other families who suspected they had been victims of similar frauds to seek justice. An unexpected aspect of the victory was the reconciliation it provided within the family itself. Some relatives who had initially sided against the siblings publicly acknowledged they were wrong and apologized for doubting the evidence. Susan went through a complex emotional process of grief and forgiveness. She cried not only for the injustice her father suffered, but also for the lost years when she could have fought to clear his name. "Children," Susan said a few days after the ruling, "you gave me back my father. Now I can remember him with pride instead of shame." The recovered property turned out to be even more valuable than Chloe and Caleb had imagined. Beyond the land itself, they discovered there were mineral and water rights that had been commercially exploited without the legitimate family receiving any compensation. Mr. Julian Vance calculated that, between the returned property and the financial compensations, Chloe and Caleb had recovered an estate worth several times more than they had initially imagined possible. But for the siblings, the financial value was secondary compared to the satisfaction of having achieved justice and cleared their grandfather's name. "Caleb," Chloe said when they were visiting the recovered property, "what are we going to do with all this?" Caleb looked around, observing the land his grandfather had loved and fought for until he was unjustly silenced. "We'll honor his memory," he replied. "We'll turn this into something that benefits the community and ensures injustices like this never happen again." They decided to use part of the property to create a free legal support center for low-income families facing inheritance disputes or suspicions of document fraud. The center would be named in honor of Grandpa Arthur. Chloe, who had discovered a passion for justice during the process, decided to study law to be able to work directly at the center. Caleb chose to develop the agricultural part of the property, implementing modern sustainable farming techniques that honored his grandfather's original vision of keeping the land productive. The shed where it all began was transformed into a small museum documenting the history of the family fraud, serving as a reminder for future generations about the importance of questioning injustices and fighting for the truth. Gregory, facing the legal consequences of his actions and those of his father, eventually sought out Chloe and Caleb for a final conversation. "I want to apologize," Gregory said during the meeting. "Not just for the crimes my father committed, but for trying to stop you from discovering the truth. Deep down, I knew you were right." "Why didn't you support us from the beginning?" asked Chloe. "Fear, shame, misplaced family pride," admitted Gregory. "And also because part of me didn't want to accept that my father was capable of such cruel things." Caleb extended his hand to Gregory. "Uncle, what matters is that the truth was discovered. Now we can all move forward with a clear conscience." The reconciliation with Gregory symbolized the gradual healing of the family divisions caused by the discovery of the truth. Although some relationships would never fully return to what they were before, a new family dynamic based on honesty and mutual respect began to take hold. Otis, the former Land Registry Office employee who had been crucial to validating the siblings' findings, became a beloved figure in the family. Chloe and Caleb visited him regularly, listening to his stories about the old days and thanking him for his courage in testifying to the truth. "You gave me the chance to finally do the right thing," said Otis during one of the visits. "I carried that guilt for decades, and now I can die in peace knowing I helped bring about justice." The Harrison family story became a case study in law schools in the region, used to teach students about the importance of preserving evidence, the dangers of family corruption, and the power of persistence in the pursuit of justice. Mr. Julian Vance, whose work on the case had gained significant professional recognition, went on to specialize in historical fraud cases and became a known advocate for the rights of families who had been victims of similar schemes. The legal support center, created on the recovered property, served hundreds of families in its first years of operation, helping to resolve inheritance disputes and identify other historical frauds in the region. Chloe, now a law school graduate, worked at the center alongside other volunteer lawyers, offering her services for free to families who couldn't afford private legal assistance. Caleb developed the agricultural part of the property into a prosperous and sustainable operation, employing people from the local community and using techniques that respected the environment. He often mentioned that he felt the approving presence of his grandfather when he walked the land that had finally returned to the rightful family. The criminal investigation continued for months after the civil victory, resulting in multiple convictions and a significant cleanup process in the local public administration. The case became a landmark in the fight against historical corruption in the region. An unexpected consequence of the victory was the interest of other families in investigating their own family histories. Several people approached Chloe and Caleb, asking for advice on how to investigate suspicions of fraud in their own family inheritances. "You've inspired an entire generation to question and investigate family injustices," commented Mr. Julian Vance during the first anniversary of the legal victory. The psychological impact of the victory on Susan was profound and lasting. She underwent months of therapy to process decades of unnecessary guilt about having doubted her father, but eventually managed to turn that pain into a driving force to support other families in similar situations. Susan became an active volunteer at the Legal Support Center, using her personal experience to console others who discovered they had been deceived about their own families. "I understand the pain of discovering your own family lied to you your whole life," Susan would say to other victims. "But I can also say that the truth, even if painful, is always better than living based on a lie." The success of the Legal Support Center caught the attention of governmental and non-governmental organizations, which offered funding to expand the services to other regions. Chloe and Caleb decided to accept the financial support, but they kept direct control over the operations to ensure the original mission of honoring their grandfather's memory was preserved. 3 years after the initial discovery of the documents in the shed, Chloe and Caleb organized a special ceremony to unveil a commemorative plaque on the reclaimed property. The plaque, installed near the site of the original shed, read, "In memory of Arthur Harrison, 1920-1992, who fought for the truth until the end and whose example teaches us that justice may be delayed, but it should never be forgotten." Family, friends, community members, and even some of the people who had been helped by the Legal Aid Center attended the ceremony. Mr. Otis, now 85 but still sharp, was invited to give a speech about the importance of speaking the truth even when it is difficult or dangerous. "Arthur Harrison was a courageous man who refused to accept an injustice," said Mr. Otis during his speech. "His grandchildren inherited that courage and used it to do what I should have done decades ago: fight for the truth regardless of the consequences." The ceremony was moving for everyone present, but especially for Susan, who could finally publicly honor her father's memory without shame or doubts about his sanity. "Dad," said Susan during her own speech, "forgive me for taking so long to believe your word. But your grandchildren finished the work you started, and now the whole world knows you were a man of integrity who was the victim of a great injustice." In the years that followed, the Harrison family's story continued to inspire others to question official versions of family events and to seek the truth even when it seemed impossible or unpopular. The Legal Aid Center expanded to include family mediation services, educational programs on inheritance rights, and even a historical archive documenting cases of family fraud in the region. Chloe specialized in complex inheritance fraud cases and became a regional authority in the field, often consulted by other lawyers facing similar cases. Caleb transformed the farm into a model of sustainability, offering courses and consulting for other farmers interested in environmentally responsible techniques. The family, though scarred by the process of discovering the truth, emerged stronger and more united by the shared experience of seeking justice. 5 years after the initial discovery, Chloe and Caleb received an official recognition from the Regional Bar Association for their contribution to social justice through the Legal Aid Center. During the acceptance speech, Chloe reflected on the journey they had taken since that day, when they found the mysterious shed on the property inherited from their grandmother. "We started out trying to understand our family's past," said Chloe. "We ended up discovering not only the truth about our grandfather, but also our own mission to help other families find the truth about their own histories. The shed, which initially seemed to be just an abandoned building, turned out to be the guardian of the truth our family needed," added Caleb. "It taught us that sometimes the answers we seek are closer than we think, waiting only for us to have the courage to look." The story of the discovery in the shed became a local legend, told and retold as an example of how persistence and courage can eventually triumph over injustice and corruption. Children in the region learned about Arthur Harrison in school, not as a man who had abandoned his family due to mental problems, but as a hero who had fought for the truth, even when it cost him his freedom and eventually his life. The impact of the story spread beyond the region, being documented in academic papers, journalistic reports, and even in a documentary produced by a university about historical fraud in Brazilian families. Chloe and Caleb were often invited to give talks about their experience, always emphasizing the importance of questioning official versions of history when evidence suggests inconsistencies. "Our experience taught us that truth has a force of its own," Chloe would often say during her talks. "Even when it's buried for decades, even when powerful people try to silence it, the truth eventually finds a way to emerge." The Legal Support Center became a model replicated in other regions of the country, always maintaining the fundamental principles established by Chloe and Caleb: to offer free legal assistance, to prioritize the search for truth over financial interests, and to honor the memory of victims of historical injustices. 10 years after the initial discovery, the family organized a special celebration to mark a decade of the Legal Support Center's operation. During the celebration, it was announced that the center had helped over 1,000 families resolve inheritance disputes and identify historical fraud. Mr. Otis, now 90 years old, was still present at the celebration, proud to have played a crucial role in uncovering the truth. "Seeing justice being done decades after witnessing the injustice gives me hope that it's never too late to do the right thing," Mr. Otis said during a brief speech at the celebration. Uncle Gregory, who had faced the legal consequences of his actions and dedicated himself to making amends for his father's crimes, was also present. His presence symbolized the possibility of redemption and reconciliation even after serious family injustices. "I learned that hiding the truth causes more pain than revealing it," Uncle Gregory said during the celebration. "My niece and nephew taught me that the courage to seek the truth is more valuable than the convenience of maintaining comfortable lies." The celebration included the inauguration of a specialized library on family law and conflict resolution, funded with part of the resources recovered through the legal process. The library was named the Arthur Harrison Library and included not only legal books, but also an archive of historical cases of family fraud that served as a research resource for lawyers, students, and families facing similar situations. During the following decade, the influence of the Harrison family story continued to expand. The case became a legal precedent in several courts, being cited in decisions related to inheritance fraud and the rights of families victimized by historical corruption. Chloe eventually opened her own law firm, specializing in complex family fraud cases, always maintaining a close partnership with the Legal Support Center to ensure that families without financial resources also had access to justice. Caleb developed the farm into one of the most sustainable and prosperous operations in West Texas, serving as an example of how modern techniques can be combined with respect for tradition and the land. Susan, now a grandmother to 2 of Chloe's children, dedicated significant time to telling the children the true stories about their great-grandfather Arthur, ensuring that future generations knew his true history. "I want you to always remember," Susan would tell her grandchildren, "that your great-grandfather was a courageous man who fought for the truth, and that your parents continued that fight until justice was done. You carry this legacy of courage and honesty." The original property, which had been the center of the family dispute, was transformed into a complex that included the Legal Support Center, the library, the sustainable farming operation, and a small museum dedicated to the history of the family fraud and its resolution. The complex received visitors from across the region, including law students, researchers interested in historical corruption, and families seeking inspiration for their own fights for justice. 20 years after the initial discovery in the shed, Chloe and Caleb were invited to write a book about their experience. The book, titled The Buried Truth: How We Uncovered and Fought a Decades-Long Family Fraud, became a regional bestseller and was used as teaching material in law courses. The book detailed not only the legal aspects of the case, but also the emotional impact of discovering the truth about family history and the process of rebuilding family relationships based on honesty. "Our goal in writing this book," explained Chloe during the launch, "is to inspire other families who may be facing similar situations. We want them to know it's never too late to seek the truth, and that justice, even if delayed, is still justice." The book's success led to invitations to speak at universities across the country, where Chloe and Caleb shared their story as a case study on persistence, family courage, and the importance of questioning official versions of history. During one of these lectures, a student asked Chloe what had been the most difficult moment of the entire process. "The most difficult moment," replied Chloe, "was realizing that our own family had lied to us our whole lives. But the most rewarding moment was when we finally managed to clear our grandfather's name and honor his memory the way he deserved." Caleb added, "We learned that the truth can be painful in the short term, but living based on a lie is painful forever. The choice between painful truth and comfortable lie should always favor the truth." The long-term impact of the Harrison family's story extended far beyond the immediate financial or legal benefits. The story became a regional symbol of the importance of family integrity, the courage to question authority, and the power of persistence in the pursuit of justice. Other families in the region began to investigate their own family histories with more skepticism and care, questioning official versions of events when there were inconsistencies or contradictory evidence. The Legal Support Center continued to grow and expand, eventually establishing partnerships with universities to offer internships for law students interested in social justice and family rights. Chloe became a visiting professor at several universities, teaching courses on family fraud, conflict resolution, and legal ethics. Her personal story served as a practical example of the theoretical concepts she taught. Caleb was recognized nationally for his sustainable farming techniques and became a consultant for other farmers interested in combining productivity with environmental responsibility. The property that had been the center of the original dispute became a model for how family conflicts can be resolved in a way that benefits not only those involved, but the entire community. The small museum they had created expanded into a broader educational center that offered workshops on family conflict resolution, inheritance rights, and family history preservation. 30 years after the initial discovery, Chloe and Caleb organized a special ceremony to mark 3 decades of justice served and to honor the memory of all the people who had played important roles in their journey. Mr. Otis had passed away several years earlier, but his family was present to represent him. Mr. Julian Vance, now retired but still active as a consultant, was honored for his crucial role in the legal victory. Uncle Gregory, now an elderly man who had spent decades making amends for his father's crimes, was recognized for his eventual courage in supporting the search for truth. "This celebration isn't just about our family," said Chloe during the ceremony's main speech. "It's about all families who found the courage to question official versions of history, to seek the truth even when it was difficult, and to fight for justice even when it seemed impossible." Caleb added, "Our grandpa Arthur began this fight over 40 years ago. We continued it, but it doesn't end with us. Every family we help, every injustice we correct, every truth we uncover, continues his legacy." The ceremony included the unveiling of a permanent memorial dedicated to Arthur Harrison and all victims of family fraud in the region. The memorial included the names of other people who had been victims of similar schemes and who had been identified through the work of the Legal Support Center. During the ceremony, Susan, now an 85-year-old lady, gave an emotional speech about the importance of preserving truth for future generations. "My grandchildren now know the true story of their great-grandfather," said Susan. "They know he was a hero, not a man who abandoned his family. That is the greatest victory of all, ensuring the next generation grows up knowing the truth." The impact of the Harrison family story spread internationally when their case was included in a global study on family corruption and judicial systems. The study highlighted how the persistence of ordinary individuals can eventually overcome systems of corruption that seemed insurmountable. Chloe was invited to participate in international conferences on family rights and social justice, always bringing her grandfather's story as an example of how victims of historical injustices can eventually receive recognition and reparation. The Legal Support Center became a model studied and replicated in other countries, particularly in regions where historical family frauds were significant but underreported problems. The specialized family law library grew to include resources in multiple languages, serving international researchers interested in similar cases of family fraud and their resolutions. 40 years after the unjust death of Arthur Harrison, his story had transformed from a family tragedy into an international symbol of hope, perseverance, and the eventual power of truth over injustice. Chloe and Caleb, now middle-aged, often reflected on how their lives had been shaped by that day when they decided to investigate a mysterious shed on the property inherited from their grandmother. "If we hadn't been curious about that shed," Chloe remarked during a conversation with Caleb, "our family would still be living based on a lie, and Grandpa would still be remembered as crazy instead of a hero. And hundreds of other families would never have received the help they needed," added Caleb. "It's astonishing how one moment of curiosity can change so many lives." They had learned that truth, even when buried for decades, has a way of eventually surfacing when courageous people are willing to look for it and fight for it. The Harrison family story became a legend that would be told for generations, not just as a tale of belated justice, but as a reminder that questioning, investigating, and fighting for truth are responsibilities each generation must take on. The original shed where everything had begun was preserved as a historical symbol, with a plaque that read, "Here began a 40-year journey in search of the truth. May this structure always remind us that the answers we seek may be closer than we imagine." Visitors from across the country came to see the shed and hear the story of how two young siblings had turned a casual discovery into a justice movement that benefited hundreds of families. The property around the shed became a pilgrimage center for families facing their own inheritance disputes, offering not only practical legal assistance, but also spiritual inspiration to keep fighting for the truth, even when it seemed impossible. Chloe and Caleb established a permanent fund to ensure that the Legal Support Center and all its associated programs would continue operating even after they were no longer directly involved. "We want to ensure Grandpa Arthur's legacy continues to benefit families for many generations," explained Chloe when establishing the fund. The fund was structured to be self-sustaining, using income from conservative investments to fund the center's basic operations, while donations and fees from successful cases funded expansions and special programs. 50 years after Arthur began his fight for the truth, the family organized a final celebration to mark half a century of seeking justice. The celebration attracted hundreds of people, including families who had been helped by the center, students and researchers who had studied the case, and members of the legal community who recognized the story's historical importance. During the celebration, it was announced that the Harrison family story would be permanently included in the region's school curriculum as part of teaching about civil rights, moral courage, and the importance of questioning authority. Arthur Harrison never imagined his personal fight for justice would eventually benefit thousands of other families, said retired Judge Silas Whitlock during a speech at the celebration. But that is the power of truth. It multiplies and spreads far beyond its origins. Chloe, now a grandmother herself, reflected on how the discovery in the shed had changed not only her family, but the entire community. "We started out trying to understand our own family history," she said. "We ended up creating a legacy that I hope will continue inspiring people to seek truth and fight for justice for many generations." The celebration concluded with the unveiling of a permanent sculpture of Arthur Harrison in the center of the town's main square. The sculpture showed him holding documents and looking determinedly toward the horizon, symbolizing his tireless struggle for the truth. The plaque at the base of the sculpture read, "Arthur Harrison, 1920 to 1992. An ordinary man who refused to accept an extraordinary injustice. His courage continues to inspire the search for truth." During the sculpture unveiling ceremony, children from the local school recited poems they had written about courage, honesty, and the importance of fighting for what is right. Mr. Arthur teaches us that even when we are alone, even when no one believes us, we must keep fighting for the truth, recited one of the children. The Harrison family story had transformed from a personal tragedy into a source of community inspiration, teaching generations about the power of persistence, the importance of family integrity, and the need to always question when something doesn't seem right. The Legal Support Center continued its operations, now expanded to include educational programs, family mediation services, and even a scholarship program for law students interested in social justice. Chloe and Caleb, satisfied with the legacy they had built, gradually passed the operational responsibility of the center to the next generation, remaining involved as consultants and inspirational symbols. They were often sought out by other families at the start of their own journeys of discovery, offering practical advice and moral encouragement based on their unique experience. "The journey will be difficult," they would often tell these families. "There will be times when you question whether it's worth continuing, but remember, the truth has its own power, and justice, even if delayed, is still justice." The property where it all began became a protected historical landmark, ensuring that future generations would always have access to the physical history of how two young siblings turned a casual discovery into a justice movement that changed hundreds of lives. The shed, now restored but retaining its original appearance, remained the symbolic heart of the entire operation, reminding visitors that sometimes the most important answers are hidden in the most unexpected places. The Harrison family's story continues to inspire new generations of lawyers, social justice activists, and ordinary people facing their own struggles against family or community injustices. Most importantly, the story serves as a permanent reminder that it is never too late to seek the truth, that individual courage can eventually overcome systems of corruption, and that the most valuable legacy we can leave for future generations is an unwavering commitment to honesty and justice. End of story. This was a fictional story created to touch our hearts. Now tell us what you thought. Leave your honest opinion in the comments and tell us, do you believe Chloe and Caleb made the right decisions? What would you have done in their place? Your participation is very important to us. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one.